Welcome to my channel. Sit back and listen to the best true crime stories. Let's go. These cases are all copycat and easily predictable. They are not shocking. They are commonplace. We just don't want to know what we know. Michelle Oberman's article, Searching for Answers About Mothers Who Kill. It was as if she was unhappy, and therefore wanted everyone to be unhappy too. Or even worse, she wasn't satisfied and happy until she hurt someone. A therapist patient about his mother suffering from borderline disorder. Listen to this. Husband. Tomorrow at dawn, we're taking the kids into the middle of the woods. They'll never find their way home, and that way we'll be rid of them. Hansel and Gretel, Jane Doe in Degree 1. On July 17, 1984, Mabel Harrison was driving along California Highway 89 when she noticed a bright light in the woods near the road near Lake Tahoe. Highway 89 is highlighted with a red line and runs through forests and mountains from North to South California, being the main road in many communities in the Sierra Nevada and Cascade Mountains. Lake Tahoe can be seen at the southern end of the highway. The place of action is the state of California. USA. She became worried, thinking a forest fire had started, and set out to find out what was wrong. Mabel started down the cliff to where the fire was, but smelled a disgusting stench and became even more worried. She ran back out onto the highway and caught the attention of the truck driver, Robert Eden. He noticed Mabel flailing her arms with all her might and stopped to ask what was wrong. After hearing her out, he grabbed a fire extinguisher from his truck, and together they hurried to the bottom of the hill. As they managed to put out the fire and the smoke cleared, a charred human body came into view. Robert raced back to his truck and radioed the authorities to report the discovery. Emergency responders and Tahoe City detectives Russell Potts and Larry Adams soon arrived on the scene. Potts also requested the presence of criminologist Michael Saggs and Placer County Sheriff Donald Nunes. The men took soil samples, took photographs of the area, and recorded the location of the body 7 feet from the highway. The body was badly burned, and the only part that suffered the least damage was the left side of the face. The lower part of the left leg had been severed and was on the ground near the fire pit. However, it was clear that it was a woman as the breasts, though badly burned, were visible. Detectives collected more than 30 pieces of evidence found on and near the body, including a green Pepsodent brand toothbrush, Gloria Vanderbilt jeans, a black and yellow scarf, a size 32 CJC Penney's bra, and several other articles of clothing, a black onyx bracelet, ring earrings, and diapers. After completing their work at the scene, detectives labeled the recovered body as Jane Doe number 487384 and sent it to the Placer County morgue. Forensic pathologist Dr. Cunha performed an autopsy and noted that the body showed signs of a beating, as well as stab wounds on the back and a long knife-like cut. The forensics showed that the victim had been doused with gasoline. They also found pieces of duct tape around Jane Doe's mouth and wrists. An ovarian tumor found on the victim could indicate a beating shortly before death. All of the wounds combined were life-threatening, but the expert opinion was that the immediate cause of death was smoke inhalation. The woman's age was determined to be between 18 and 22 years old. Jane Doe's fingers were then separated and sent to Sacramento for fingerprinting. Her upper and lower jaws were also separated in case there was a match to someone else's dental records. Because of the diapers found near the fire, police had a theory that the girl was with a small child and they were victims of kidnapping and abuse. The worry was that the child may have still been alive and in danger, but neither the identity of Jane Doe nor the fate of her child could be determined. No one has filed a wanted report on a woman matching the victim's height and weight, nor has anyone identified the sketch that was drawn up.
Jane Doe en Graad 2.
A year later, Elmer Barber and his wife were making the rounds of the Martis Creek campground. This was their morning duty since they worked at the campground and had to make sure everything was in order and ready to receive guests. While looking around the campground, they noticed a cardboard box and figured it must be trash left behind by campers. Elmer got out of the car to remove the box and discovered the body of a girl with her hands and feet bound with ropes. The remains found were in such a stage of decomposition that identification was very difficult and cause of death impossible. The only distinguishing feature recorded by the experts was chipped teeth of unknown origin on the front teeth. As in the case of the first discovery, the disappearance of this girl was not reported to the police. She was given the name Jane Doe number 660785. Autopsies on both Jane Does were conducted by the same coroner, but he deduced no connection between the two murders. As it turns out, there was one. The deceased were sisters. Terry on December 27, 1993, the Nevada County, California Sheriff's Office received a call. It was received by Ron Perea. The woman identified herself as Theresa Knorr. She said that the call was inspired by watching America's Most Wanted series based on real crimes. Although none of the crimes from the show involved her or her family, she suddenly felt she had to call the police and tell her story. Her call was later forwarded to Placer County Police. Ron Perea was dumbfounded by the girl's story and decided to personally interview her. He immediately flew to Salt Lake City, where Terry lived, to hear her out. While wandering the streets, she struggled with mental illness and addictions, and to survive, Terry often broke the law. Still, this lifestyle suited her better than returning to her home. Every time she was arrested for another offense, Terry told the police about what she had to endure as a child, but no one believed the girl, considering her crazy. The state ordered her to have mandatory sessions with a therapist, but the doctor didn't believe her stories either. This time she told that her sisters Susan and Sheila Knorr had been subjected to a terrible massacre. And the killer was the girl's own mother, Theresa Knorr, maiden name Theresa Cross. Theresa Jimmy Francine Knorr was born on March 12, 1946 to Jim and Swanee Gay Cross in Sacramento, California. In addition to her, they had one other daughter older than Theresa. Swanee also had two children, William and Clara, from a previous marriage, and her first husband had passed away. Jim worked as a cheese maker's helper and Swanee labored at a machine making pencils. The family lived well, and in the 1950s they moved from their small house in Sacramento to a larger new home in Rio Linda, California. In 1958, however, the formerly happy life came to an end. Jim was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. As a result of unsuccessful brain surgery, he was unable to continue to go to work, and his wife had to take on her shoulders to take care of the income and the sick husband and the girls. Jim fell into depression and began to take it out on the children frequently. According to family friends, Theresa was a loner and often envied her sister Rosemary. The girls often quarreled and fought then for the attention of a neighbor boy, or his own mother, who more singled out Theresa. In turn, the latter simply adored her mother. So it lasted until March 1961, when Swanee suddenly had a massive heart attack. It was Theresa then was next to her mother, and of course, for a 15-year-old girl to see her mother dying was a terrible shock. Overnight she lost the closest person, and it affected her psyche. Theresa for a long time plunged into severe depression, and later she was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. This is a disease characterized by impulsiveness and instability in everything: relationships, emotions, moods, behavior. The term borderline itself implies being in between, on the border of two states. Initially, it was implied that the disorder occupies an intermediate place between psychosis and neurosis because it manifests symptoms of both at the same time. The outbursts of aggression and inability to control emotions are similar to bipolar disorder. Persons with this disorder do not tolerate loneliness, so sometimes make desperate efforts not to be left alone, up to suicide attempts, wanting to get the attention and care of others. Also, people with this disorder are characterized by such traits as high levels of anxiety, empathy deficit, frequent subdepressive states, tendency to reckless actions and risk-taking, hostility, extreme fickleness of goals and values, black and white perception of life and others without the ability to distinguish emotional shades and nuances, exaggeratedly distorted reactions to situations of little significance, a feeling of emptiness inside due to a weakly expressed and unstable image of the inner self. In the life of such people reigns chaos. Today they want to be an artist, tomorrow to conquer Everest, in a week to become the world's best cook. So even the smart and talented of them hard to achieve success in their careers. The same chaos rules in their relationships. Violent conflicts and scandals, painful attachment and fears that the partner will abandon, up to the fact that they themselves abandon partners. Just to avoid being in the position of abandonment, they flounder from excessive involvement in the life of a partner, clinginess, to leave him. They are also prone to self-harm to the point of suicide, alcohol and other addictions, and eating disorders. Jim was unable to maintain the expensive house without his wife's earnings, and soon had to sell it. Theresa, now deprived of all the elements that had previously given her a sense of family and security, threw herself into the arms of the first man she met. He turned out to be Clifford Clyde Sanders. They met at the home of mutual friends, and within weeks they were swearing their love for each other and planning a wedding. Cliff was 5 years older than Theresa and worked as a carpenter in the small rural community of Galt. On September 29, 1962, they were married and moved into a small apartment in the North Highlands area of California. Theresa dropped out of school and quickly became pregnant. The North Highlands neighborhood, along with Rio Linda, Galt, and other communities, is part of the Sacramento metropolitan area. July 16, 1963, she gave birth to her first child, Howard Clyde Sanders. It would seem that finally in the life of the girl appeared stability, which she so lacked after the departure of her mother. But her relationship with her husband rapidly deteriorated, because Theresa simply obsessed with him. She controlled his every move, jealous of his every woman, constantly suspected of cheating and arranged scandals and nagging because of this, and even followed Cliff, checking if he is not meeting someone in secret from her. Soon she was pregnant with her second child. They moved to a bigger house on Elm Avenue in Galt. Her suspicions and scandals continued, however, and soon Cliff was fed up with the marriage. He announced to his wife that he was going to leave. This came as a shock to Theresa, and she was hysterical for a long time, crying and begging her husband not to leave her with the children. She was pregnant at the time, and Cliff felt sorry for her. He obeyed and didn't leave his family that time. But, as you can guess, new quarrels did not last long. Things got heated on June 22, 1964, when Clifford, instead of spending the day with his family, went to a bar with friends. When he returned home, Theresa could not contain the anger that had been simmering in her all day, and attacked him with accusations that he did not spend time with his family and wasted the money the children needed on booze. Cliff was obviously in no mood for discussion and interrupted her tirade with a fist, hitting her in the face. Theresa immediately pulled herself together and ran to the police station, where she reported the assault and bodily harm. However, when Clifford came to arrest her, she did not sign the paperwork and all charges were dropped. On July 5, 1964, Clifford's birthday, they started fighting again. Theresa again accused him of infidelity, and this time he finally decided he had had enough. The next day, July 6, Cliff packed his belongings and announced that he was leaving her. Theresa became enraged, grabbed her .30 caliber rifle, and fired a shot into Cliff's chest area, hitting him directly in the heart. He died instantly. One of the first to arrive on the scene was Galt's chief of police, Walter Froelich. I grabbed the shotgun to stop his blows and it went off, Theresa explained. Clifford was lying face down in the kitchen doorway, and the rifle was leaned against the wall at the opposite end of the kitchen. Froelich took Theresa to the Sacramento County Jail, and baby Howard was turned over to the care of Theresa's relatives. The next day, July 7, 1964, the local newspaper reported the incident. The first paragraph of the article stated, Deputy District Attorney Donald Dorfman said, he plans to file a murder charge today against 18-year-old Theresa Sanders of Galt for her husband killed by rifle fire. Clifford Sanders, 23, was killed yesterday morning at their small home in Galt. Detectives said the bullet apparently grazed his left hand and traveled through his heart. On August 4, 1964, Theresa pleaded not guilty by reason of self-defense. Led by Judge Charles Johnson, the trial began 3 weeks later. On August 30, 1964, he began his courtroom appearance. Dorfman insisted that Theresa had killed her husband in cold blood and fabricated a story of self-defense just to avoid jail time. In his opinion, the motive for the murder was Theresa's speculation about her husband's infidelity. Then came the lawyer of the defendant, Robert Zarek, who convinced the audience that Theresa's actions were dictated by self-defense and the girl needed to save herself and the child from her angry husband. One of the first witnesses called was Dr. Arthur Wallace, who had performed the autopsy of Clifford Sanders. He testified that there were no powder burns on the body and tests determined that Sanders had no alcohol in his blood. He described the deceased's wound and testified that a .30 caliber bullet passed through Clifford Sanders' hand before lodging in his heart. My guess, and I believe it is correct, is that the deceased's hand was in all probability in a position in front of his rib cage, Wallace said. The fact that the bullet lodged in the soft tissue of the heart shows that it had slowed considerably when it struck the chest. A criminologist then testified that a .30-.30 caliber rifle found at the scene was the murder weapon. Police Chief Froelich described the crime scene and the events leading up to Theresa's arrest. Finally, as if to summarize the prosecution's position, Dorfman interviewed several witnesses from Sanders' family and acquaintances to prove that he was not a violent and aggressive man. Theresa took a firm stand and defended it with enviable conviction. She was the victim in this family, constantly having to endure the beatings of her alcoholic husband. Mental health counselor Dr. Leroy Walter described Theresa as anxious, frightened, and full of remorse. He was certain that it was an act of self-defense and that Theresa was not capable of cold-blooded, calculated murder. Theresa's friends and family, in turn, amplified Leroy Walter's testimony by describing her as a sweet, innocent girl unaware of the hardships she was condemning herself to by marrying Sanders. The final hearing began on September 21, 1964. Dorfman repeated his initial statements and insisted that Theresa killed her husband because of jealousy. There is no question that this is premeditated murder in the first degree. Not every murderer looks like the witch from Snow White. She's only 18 and pregnant. But that does not eliminate the fact that she maliciously murdered her husband, without provocation on his part, Dorfman said before the jury. On September 22, 1964, the jury rendered a verdict of not guilty. Moreover, they sincerely felt sorry for Theresa and wanted to console her, hugged her and patted her shoulders, saying that finally she, poor thing, freed from the clutches of her monster husband. Dorfman, on the other hand, was dumbfounded by the jury's decision. Life goes on. Theresa took Howard away from her family and was taken in by family friends. She was pregnant with her second child, young and alone. And although their marriage to Sanders could not be called a happy one, she had a sense of belonging to a family then. Now once again all stability was gone from her life. To cope with life's hardships and black thoughts, Theresa began drinking, and increasingly she drowned her sorrows at the local American Legion Hall, an organization of American veterans. That's where she met Estelle Lee Thornsberry, a disabled Army veteran who had been paralyzed 2 years earlier. However, Theresa didn't seem to care, and the couple began dating. On March 13, 1965, Theresa gave birth to her second child, Sheila Gay Sanders. Even though it was someone else's child, Thornsberry cared for her and accepted her as his own. He truly loved Theresa and wished her and the children well, and soon suggested they move in together and start a family. A few weeks later, they moved into a small rented apartment together, and their life together began. At first, Thornsberry was satisfied with everything, but soon he was horrified to notice that Theresa uses him only as a nanny for the children and a source of money. Relationships, expectedly, began to deteriorate, quarrels flare up more and more often, and after a few months everything ended in a scandal when Thornsberry learned that Theresa cheats on him with his best friend. After a heated argument, she packed her things and was done. Once again, she had to beg acquaintances for shelter and help. But, understandably, she wasn't going to sit alone for long, and it wasn't long before Theresa had her eye on Marine Robert Knorr. They began to meet. A few months later, the girl became pregnant for the third time, and the couple began to plan a wedding. In February 1966, Knorr was sent to Vietnam. Twice he was not seriously wounded by bullets, and then, when he was crossing a bridge in the jungle, it suddenly exploded, and Knorr's arms and legs were significantly damaged. So he was flown back to the States, and he spent several months in the hospital. On July 9, 1966, Robert Knorr and Theresa were married and moved into an apartment in Sacramento. Robert adopted Howard and Sheila and gave them his last name. On September 27, 1966, Theresa gave birth to their third child, Susan Marlene Knorr. 3 months later, she became pregnant again and gave birth to a son, William Robert Knorr, on September 15, 1967, and another, Robert Wallace Knorr, on December 31, 1968. Hopelessness. Robert Knorr continued to work in the Army, but because of his injuries, he could soon only get a job in a memorial convoy. Although the job had its perks, he was often called away urgently, sometimes to the other side of the country, and Theresa was unhappy that her husband spent little time with his family. As with Cliff, she soon began accusing Robert of infidelity, and when he wasn't home, taking her anger out on the children. She would make them sit motionless on the floor, and if they even moved their eyes, or moved even an inch from their starting place, she would become enraged and beat them. By June 1969, Robert could no longer tolerate his wife's scandals, nagging, suspicions, and outbursts of aggression, and left Theresa. In retaliation, she filed for divorce and indicated that she had tolerated extreme cruelty from her husband. But after a few weeks, they reconciled and Theresa dropped the charges. Although Robert wanted to keep the family together, it seemed too late for that. Theresa filed for divorce again, and in June 1970, the very judge presiding over Theresa's trial after her murder of her first husband, Charles Johnson, granted the couple a divorce. 2 months later, Theresa gave birth to her sixth and final child, whom she named Theresa Marie Knorr, or simply Terry, in her honor. Despite his unwillingness to live with Theresa, Robert Knorr continued to love the children and wanted to be involved in their lives and upbringing. After the divorce, he repeatedly tried to visit them, but Theresa each time vehemently opposed and refused to let him see the children. As time passed, Robert gave up trying to see them and married another woman. Theresa had no intention of sitting alone either and began dating railroad worker Ronald Pulliam. They married in 1971 and purchased a home on the east side of Sacramento. From the outside, they looked like a beautiful family, but in reality, and to this husband, Theresa soon began to treat him as her property rather than her partner. In addition, as with Thornsberry, she began to leave the children in his care and disappear nights in bars and parties. Eventually, she stopped coming home altogether. Ronald suspected that Theresa cheated on him and filed for divorce. September 27, 1972, the same judge, Charles Johnson, approved the divorce. Theresa began drowning her yearnings in alcohol again and spending most of her time at the American Legion Hall in Rio Linda. That's where she met 59-year-old Chet Harris, editor of the Sacramento Union newspaper. The couple quickly hit it off, and within 3 days of meeting, on August 23, 1976, they were married. But as soon as they began to live together, Theresa discovered, to her disappointment, that her husband loves to take pictures of naked women, and all the walls of his bedroom are taped with such pictures. The new husband demanded that Theresa pose for him, but was refused. She began to hate her new husband, while one of her daughters, Susan, on the contrary, became close to him. Theresa watched with anger as Chet and Susan spent hours putting together jigsaw puzzles or discussing mythology, and although she herself was not close to the children, she felt that no one should come between them and her and try to take her place. Just 2 months after the wedding, Theresa filed for divorce, and on December 17, 1976, Judge Charles Johnson granted the divorce again. After this last divorce, The children noticed that Theresa, who had always been controlling and unpredictable, had changed for the worse. She started drinking heavily, became overweight, and stopped looking after herself. Theresa became paranoid, took her children out of school, disconnected her phone to cut off communication with the outside world, and stopped letting her children out of the house and forbade them to bring their friends. The punishments and beatings increased and became more and more subtle. Dr. Christine Lawson, in her book Understanding Borderline Mothers, describes 4 characteristic role models that can illustrate borderline mental illness: the vagabond, the ascetic, the queen, and the witch. However, often these role types are not mutually exclusive and are closely intertwined. Examples of mothers with borderline disorder playing the role of witch can be found even in old fairy tales, such as Hansel and Gretel. Of course, not all mothers with this disorder beat or kill their children, but all children of such mothers live in constant terror, and even the sight of the mother instills terror in them. Often they feel safe only at school or at the house of friends. Coming home after school frightens them, for they never know what mood their mother is in this time, or what mistake they will now concentrate on. Such children are often the first to notice, though, the last to admit that there is something wrong with their mother, and it is only in adulthood that some of them begin to talk about the suffering they endured as children, with adults who have known their mother for years usually showing shock and distress because they suspected nothing all along. When we hugged our mother hard, who were we trying to convince? That we loved her, or that she loved us? On the other hand, if we didn't hug and kiss her and tell her how much we loved her, then that meant we didn't love her, and we were vicious children. We were the devil's seeds given to her by Bob Knorr, Terry recounted. Their mother, who had just seemed calm and friendly, could change in a second and become uncontrollably furious. She was always looking for faults in her children, and often punished them for misdeeds that didn't exist. As the girls grew older, Theresa hated them for their youth and attractiveness, and from then on she was haunted by obsessive paranoid ideas that her daughters were conspiring to steal her beauty. One day she got very drunk, as usual, and decided to remove her eyebrows and eyelashes, and when, sober, she woke up and found that they were as if erased from her face, she blamed it on her daughters, who, according to her plan, deliberately harmed her to spoil her beauty. All the rage and madness of the woman fell mostly on her daughters. She often beat them, using a homemade instrument of punishment, a board about a meter long with duct tape wound on one side instead of a handle, burned them with cigarettes, deprived them of sleep and food, forced them to do all the work in the house and on the plot all day long, and sometimes even threw knives at them as live targets. She also made other children hold the ones she beat so they wouldn't run away. Once she put little Terry in a freezer cupboard and made Howard sit on top so she wouldn't get loose. And another time, in another impulsive impulse, she put a loaded gun to the girl's head, after which Terry had nightmares for months. Another was Theresa's attitude to her sons. She loved them, punished them less, and in time stopped punishing them altogether, allowed them a lot, and even let them go out of the house to meet friends and work part-time. She made them her assistants in punishing the girls, and the boys, having watched and participated in violence since childhood, stopped perceiving their sisters as living people, so they felt neither pity nor remorse. In addition, they realized that it was better to abuse their sisters together with their mother than to be beaten themselves, and they obediently followed their mother's instructions. Theresa instilled in the children that such things happen in every family and that their lives were normal. Terrified of being punished and believing that they really had nothing to complain about and no one to complain to, they never spoke up about what was happening in their family or went to the child welfare authorities or the police. Sometimes Theresa tried to be a good mother and do things for her children, taking them to the mountains, organizing small family birthday parties, once even selling her diamond ring to buy Terry new clothes and shoes. But such bright moments were rare exceptions in their family to the horrible, cold darkness of control, nagging, and subtle punishments. Despite her disorder and mental instability, Theresa worked, caring for the elderly in nursing homes and the sick in hospitals. People with borderline mental disorder, although it is difficult for them, can sometimes give the impression of being normal good workers, mothers. No one around her realized what a monster Theresa was inside her home. In fact, her mental state was deteriorating with each passing year. Theresa's two eldest daughters had it the hardest. She hated young women, including her older daughters. While she grew older, fatter and lower due to drinking and illness, the older daughters became more and more beautiful. They had something that Theresa did not: youth and attractiveness. She clearly saw them as her rivals. It made her furious, and she envied her own daughters. Susan's intelligence was very high, and while they were at school, the girl always got excellent grades. No matter what tasks the teachers gave her, she always coped easily, and in a way she was bored at school because studying was not a challenge for her. She needed adrenaline, some kind of challenge, and soon Susan started shoplifting. If she was caught, Theresa beat her mercilessly at home. Susan would try to steal something for her mother as well, to placate her and avoid punishment. In 1982, Theresa came up with the idea that her last husband, Chester Harris, had turned Susan into a witch. Susan began teasing Theresa and supporting these crazy ideas, saying that Harris would soon perform the final rite of initiation of the girl into his secret cult by deflowering her in the name of Satan. However, these delusional rants did not save the girl from her mother's rage, and Theresa, on the contrary, concentrated all her hatred on Susan, beating her more and harder than the other children. Obviously, all this got to Susan, and she began to realize that their lifestyle imposed by their mother was not normal. She was the only one of Theresa's children who dared to rebel against her mother. One day, Susan disappeared from the house for a few hours and returned with her friends to get her things. However, the brothers noticed a car outside the house and went out to see what was wrong. They got into a fight with one of the guys, and the others got scared and abandoned Susan. However, the girl was determined and soon ran away from home. But she did not have long to enjoy her freedom. She was arrested, suspected of running away from home. Susan was sent to a psychiatric hospital, and although she told doctors and police officers in detail about the horrors she and other children had suffered at the hands of her mother, Theresa managed to convince everyone that her daughter was mentally ill and prone to excessive fantasy and constant lying to manipulate people. Social services decided to interview all her children, but Theresa was present in the same room, and no one dared to confirm Susan's words and tell the horrible truth about her mother. Thus, eventually Susan was handed back into Theresa's custody. Theresa raged. Susan's escape, and even more so her frank account of life in the ancestral home, was seen as a betrayal. She beat the girl savagely that same day. She took out a pair of thick leather gloves and began to strike her. She then forced the other children to take part in the torture. Robert would later recount, "We had to pass the gloves to each other and beat Susan in the stomach for running away and everything. And I had to hit her twice because I didn't hit her hard enough the first time." Theresa feared Susan would run away again and handcuffed her to the bed at night, forcing the children to take turns guarding her. She also chained her daughter to the dinner table, gagged her, and kept her under the table for months. Gradually the girl's will was broken and she, fearing more beatings, gave up the idea of escape. She was again allowed to sleep alone and unchained. Theresa linked the crazy ideas of Susan turning into a witch to her overweight condition. She decided that it was Susan who had cast a spell on her that was contributing to her weight gain. And then forced feeding was added to the beatings already common in this family. Theresa made huge portions of macaroni and cheese, dressed them with pieces of lard and butter, and forced Susan to eat everything. When she couldn't eat anymore, Theresa force-fed her, shoving food spoonful after spoonful into her mouth. If Susan vomited, she had to eat that too. In June 1983, Susan dared to cross her mother, and she went on a violent rampage. Before the other children could realize anything, a gunshot rang out. Theresa shot her daughter with the .22 caliber pistol that Terry had already threatened her with. Susan began to gasp, fell to the floor, and wriggled in pain as blood flowed from her chest. Surprisingly, no vital organs were hit. Theresa ordered the children to carry Susan to the bathroom and put her in the tub. There was no question of calling an ambulance because Theresa was afraid of explaining herself to the police. The bullet was lodged in her body, and Theresa decided to leave it there. She bandaged the wound and applied plasters. Suddenly, Theresa began to care for and nurse Susan, once again confirming her inconsistency. She alternately played the roles of mother and monster abuser to her children. Terry and Sheila also cared for Susan by washing and feeding her. Susan spent about a month in the bathtub and began to recover. Howard had by then left the family and was living on his own. He never admitted to anyone what went on behind closed doors in his family. In November 1983, the family moved into an apartment in North Sacramento, and things went relatively well for a while. But on July 4, 1984, Theresa and Susan argued again, and Theresa stuck a pair of scissors in Susan's back. Although the wound was non-fatal, it was nonetheless quite serious. Susan, tired of the daily abuse, a few weeks later begged for permission to leave the family. Unexpectedly, Theresa agreed, but with one condition. She must remove the bullet from Susan's body so that Susan would have no evidence to corroborate her story of torture if she told it to anyone. Susan had no choice, and she consented to the operation. A couple days later, everything was ready and Theresa began the operation by injecting Susan with an entire bottle of whiskey and feeding her a handful of capsules of Mellaril, a strong antipsychotic drug. After such a cocktail, Susan passed out. According to some reports, Theresa cut Susan's back herself. According to others, she ordered 15-year-old Robert to do it with a small scalpel and feel for the bullet in the wound. But the fact remains that the bullet was removed and flushed down the toilet. Terry also acted as an assistant during the surgery. The next morning, Susan woke up and complained of unbearable pain. Theresa gave her ibuprofen and antibiotics, but they didn't seem to be working and Susan's condition deteriorated rapidly, her eyes turning yellow. Surgery had been performed without proper disinfection and Susan contracted jaundice, became lethargic, and soon spent most of her time unconscious, unable to control defecation, so they had to keep her in diapers. Terry also noticed black spots on Susan's back, which she later realized were the result of Susan's last beating. Occasionally awakening from oblivion, the girl, however, did not regain clear consciousness and was delirious and soon fell into a coma. But Theresa's sick mind did not take it seriously, and she was convinced that Susan was just pretending. She left her daughter on the kitchen floor, ordering the other children to ignore her. Perhaps that would teach the pretender something. Susan's body had turned yellow from jaundice and spreading sepsis, but Theresa believed this was evidence of her daughter's possession by evil spirits. In her opinion, only fire could cast out the devil. Susan's mouth and wrists were duct-taped shut, and she was loaded into a trunk. Her personal belongings, packed in garbage bags, went there as well. The Knorr family headed south on Highway 89 toward the woods near Lake Tahoe and pulled off the main road somewhere near the bridge over Squaw Creek. Bill and Robert pulled the still-alive Susan out of the trunk and carried her down to the creek bank. They laid her down with all her belongings, including her diapers. Theresa told her sons to pour gasoline on everything and set it on fire. Leaving the burning body behind, the family got into the car and drove away without looking back. For the first time after Susan's death, the house was quiet and gloomy, but gradually things returned to normal. In the spring of 1985, Theresa, who by then was almost entirely dependent on welfare payments, had another brilliant idea, this time about how to improve her financial situation. She decided that her 20-year-old daughter Sheila would now prostitute herself and give her the money she earned. Sheila was equally terrified by the prospect of selling her body on the streets and her mother's punishments. Either way, she was forced to comply. In the days that followed, Sheila began bringing home hundreds of dollars daily, and Theresa, seemingly delighted by the sudden abundance of money, softened her temper. She even stopped punishing her daughter and was almost proud of her, letting her go and come whenever she wanted. It could be said, as disgusting as it sounds, that in some perverse way Sheila gained an advantage through prostitution. Not for long, however, did things go on like that. In May 1985, Sheila's freedom came to an end overnight. You could say that her mother had chosen her as her new target. This time, Theresa got it into her head that Sheila had gotten pregnant and, in addition, infected her mother with a venereal disease through the toilet seat. Just as she had done with Susan, Theresa began force-feeding Sheila. Once, when she refused to eat, Theresa shoved a spoon into her mouth with such force that it damaged her front teeth. That's where the chips that the coroners noticed in the second Jane Doe came from. Theresa repeatedly beat the girl and demanded that she confess to having infected her with the disease. The brothers, as usual, took part in the punishments. After a while, Theresa ordered Sheila to be moved to a closet and forbade the other children from opening it and interacting with her. She wanted Sheila to confess, Terry recounted. That was the mother's method. Hit them until they confessed. At one point, Sheila agreed that she had infected her mother, but Theresa was unstoppable. The punishments continued. When the girl screamed and begged to be let out of the closet, Theresa only turned up the TV volume to drown out the noise. After a few days, Sheila became very weak. Her mind clouded, and she no longer had the strength to scream. She only mumbled something about going upward, toward the light, and then everyone heard a rumble and everything went quiet. 3 days later, when the closet was finally opened, Sheila's lifeless and already decomposing body fell out of there. She had probably tried to climb up the small shelves, but they couldn't support her weight, and the girl had collapsed down. In any case, she was now to be disposed of like unwanted trash. Robert was working at the movie theater at the time and brought the biggest box of popcorn cups he could find from the theater. They put Sheila's body in the box and loaded it into the trunk. After telling Terry to clean out the storage room where Sheila had spent her last days, Theresa and her sons got in the car and headed toward Lake Tahoe again. They were traveling on Interstate 80 toward the Truckee Airport. Interstate 80 stretches across many states from the West Coast to the East Coast of the United States. In the West, it starts in San Francisco and runs through 5 counties in California. After choosing a spot, they pulled up beside the road and were about to take the box out of the trunk when a police officer pulled up and noticed suspicious activity. But Theresa was able to convince him that they needed to go to the bathroom. The policeman told them to keep driving. Theresa then decided to go somewhere else and they went to Martis Creek Lake. But they did not set Sheila on fire because they were frightened by the confrontation with the policeman and were afraid someone else would notice them. So they just dumped the box with the body and returned home. If Terry hadn't called the police 9 years later, the identity of the murdered girls might still be unknown. Theresa, on the other hand, became even more paranoid after Sheila's death. In her opinion, there were clues and evidence left in the closet where she kept her daughter that would prove her crime. So on September 29, 1986, she packed her bags of belongings and told Terry to pour a flammable liquid on the closet and set it on fire. Contrary to Theresa's plan, neighbors quickly spotted the fire and called the fire department. The dwelling was not badly damaged by the fire, and an investigation launched to determine the cause of the fire revealed that the blaze was caused intentionally. Theresa and her children moved into a motel. At the time, Terry was 15 years old, and she feared that sooner or later she would become the next victim. Therefore, the girl soon ran away. She found friends who were able to shelter her for a while. She used Sheila's papers to pass as an adult. Robert stayed with his mother, and William soon moved in with his girlfriend. After listening to Terry's story, the police could hardly believe how cruel her mother had been to her children. However, the details Terry described could not have been known by an outsider, and the puzzle began to take shape. Ron Perea, after listening to Terry, took the notes he had taken during her confession to the district attorney. The data began to be verified, and soon both Jane Doe 1 and Jane Doe 2 came to light. The box containing Sheila's body was examined, and it was determined that it was, indeed, taken from a local movie theater. In addition, Robert and William's fingerprints were found on it. In November 1993, arrest warrants were finally issued for William, Robert, and Theresa. Arrest and trial. It turned out that Theresa and Robert had moved to Las Vegas, and at first things seemed to be going well until Robert made a terrible mistake on November 7, 1991. He walked into Red's Place Bar located on North Nellis Boulevard, pulled out a gun, and shot the bartender. The latter died on the spot. Robert got 16 years in prison, so he wasn't hard to find. Theresa, on the other hand, fled from the hype raised around her and her son after his crime to Salt Lake City, Utah. William was living at the time in a quiet neighborhood in the Sacramento suburb of Woodland, California. He worked in a warehouse. At first, neither Robert nor William was willing to talk to detectives, but gradually both gave in and admitted their involvement in their sisters' deaths. 5 days later, detectives received a call from Salt Lake City authorities notifying them that Theresa had been arrested for drunk driving just days earlier and could be traced by her driver's license number. Sergeant John Fitzgerald of the Placer County Sheriff's Office flew to Salt Lake City and went to the address on Theresa's driver's license. Deep in the evening, he knocked on her door and she, to the sergeant's surprise, opened without hesitation. Fitzgerald arrived just in time, however, as he found Theresa packing up her things. It turned out that Terry lived near her mother, but they did not know they were in the neighborhood. At the station, Theresa refused to cooperate with the investigation and requested an attorney. On November 15, 1993, in a Salt Lake City courtroom, she was charged with the murders of Susan and Sheila. Theresa was then extradited to Placer County and tried there. On November 15, 1993, she was charged with 2 counts of murder, 2 counts of conspiracy to murder, and 2 special circumstances, serial murder and murder by torture, that carried the death penalty. Theresa continued to insist on her innocence and remained in the Sacramento County Jail. On the same day, November 15, 1993, Judge Richard Cousins ruled that William Robert Knorr would be tried as an adult, even though he was a minor at the time he participated in the sisters' punishments. As for Robert, he agreed to testify against Theresa in exchange for a lighter sentence. A month later, all charges against him were dropped except for 1 episode of criminal conspiracy in connection with Sheila's death. When Theresa learned that Robert had made a plea bargain, she decided to protect herself from the death penalty and offered that she would plead guilty if given life. On October 17, 1995, Theresa Knorr was found guilty of the murders of Susan and Sheila. Her second husband at the trial wished her to burn in hell forever for what she had done to the children. Her son saw Theresa for the first time after several years, and even though they were already strong, grown men, it was obvious that the boys were still afraid of her. Theresa, on seeing them, fell into a strange trance that frightened everyone present. The prosecution was based entirely on Terry's story. Theresa herself chose to remain silent. Her lawyer argued that she was deeply remorseful, and at the time when she abused her daughters, suffered from alcoholism and untreated mental illness. However, the judge saw no mitigating circumstances and insisted that her crimes were characterized by extreme cruelty and incredible callousness. Thus, she received 2 life sentences. She will not have the opportunity to apply for parole until 2027, when she turns 81. Robert was still serving time for the murder of the bartender at the time of Theresa's trial, and for his involvement in the murders of Susan and Sheila, he received 3 years in prison concurrent with his current sentence, meaning he did not receive additional years to his previous sentence. He served his sentence and was released in 2014. William received a suspended sentence and was given compulsory psychiatric treatment. He has subsequently married, is working and enjoying a normal life. Terry also married, but she carried the guilt of not being able to save her sisters through her life. She was constantly plagued by nightmares. In December 2011, when she was 41, she had a heart attack and died. Shortly before her death, she said, "No living soul should be subjected to the kind of abuse that my sisters and I endured. But the truth is that in this world, people suffer daily abuse at the hands of those who were supposed to love them. The problem with these abusers is that they make us feel bad, when it is they who are doing the wrong thing."